Mike, you may need to mute.
Okay, welcome everybody, and thank you for taking the time out of your busy day to join us for this virtual session. My name is Rich Feinberg. I'm a senior psychometrician at the National Board of Medical Examiners, and I'll be your host, chair, discussant for today's session. We've got a packed session. We've got 5 presenters in total. So I'll start with a couple introductory remarks, then we'll go through the 5 presentations, and then if everything goes well, we should have about 15 to 20 minutes at the end for Q&A. So it's a lovely Friday afternoon, at least in New Jersey, so why not start with a joke? Okay. So if we were all in San Francisco, you would be in a packed room of 10,000 people howling with laughter right now. But of course that didn't happen, so you just have to imagine what that would have been like. So the cartoon here, what it's trying to get at is the idea in a purported humorous way of how much time is enough. In a standardized testing context, it of course depends, right? It depends on the type of exam, it depends on the number of examinees, it depends on it depends on at a person specific level, right? The right answer might depend on the person. The right balance is hard to find. It also depends on, well, it's changing, right? Our field is constantly changing. And so the answer also changes. So for example, the availability of technology enhanced items creates the more authentic presentation of content, but also may require more time to respond. There's also recognition that our profession lacks evidence-based guidelines for making testing accommodations, how much time to offer for people to offset disabilities. There's also evolving public perception about test fairness, with media posing serious challenges to the relevance of time limits on high-stakes tests. Now, considering issues like these, the National Board of Medical Examiners began investigating time limits for a number of years. And one thing we found was the questions that we asked tended to prompt more questions like, to what extent is response speed part of the construct of interest? And how much does the construct change as a result of more generous time limits? Should 2 people who get the same score, do they actually have the same level of proficiency if one person used far more time than the other person? And also things like, what expectations do stakeholders have regarding time limits, and should that be factored into policy decisions? So in pursuit of these types of answers to these sorts of questions, the NBME brought together scholars from lots of different fields on a sponsored conference back in October of 2017, affectionately branded as the TIME Conference, TIME standing for Timing Impact on Measurement in Education. And some of you may have actually attended that conference. And the work that came out of it was summarized in a recently published book as part of the NCME Book Series. Actually, the online publication was this past June. And today's session is presenting 5 chapters from that book. The NCME Book Series webpage hasn't been updated yet, and that might be because they've been busy with a little thing called the summer series of virtual presentations and also the annual meeting that's happening next week. So for now, I just provided here a link. It's also in the chat for the publisher website, where you can see, here's what it looks like when you go there. So you can see more about the book. If you want to make a purchase, it's all here. You can make that decision. Here's just a listing of all the chapters in the book to give you a sense of what's included. The highlighted chapters are what we're going to be going over today. So with that said, I will pass this off to our first presenter, Daniel Jurich, who will be talking about a history of test speededness, tracing the evolution of theory and practice. Dan?
Thank you, Rich. As Rich mentioned, I'm Dan Jurich. I'm also from the NBME, and I'm going to be discussing a brief history of test speededness. A perfect title for this presentation would have been A Brief History of Time. Unfortunately, Stephen Hawking beat me to that one. And so the first evidence, documented evidence that I was able to find of timed standardized testing dates back all the way to the 15th century with the Chinese civil service examination, as illustrated here, where examinees had one night and one day to write a series of poems and essays that would be graded on penmanship and style. In the United States, the Army really led the kind of forefront, was at the forefront of timed standardized testing with the Army Alpha and Beta examinations that were used for recruits in World War I. And you can see by this picture that our test administration procedures have certainly improved. But let's see how timing has changed throughout time. And so as mentioned in the title of my presentation, I'm talking about this in the context of test speededness. And the idea is that time limits can influence validity of scores. Now, Michael Kane will be discussing that in much more detail in our next presentation and in his chapter within our book. But the idea is that time limits can introduce construct-irrelevant variance. Even when speed is construct-relevant, if it's misrepresented, the proportion, the degree of speed in the construct, then that is also an issue. And so this idea that time limits can be a threat to validity has been termed test speededness. And the standards define this as the extent to which test takers' scores depend on the rate at which work is performed, as well as on the correctness of responses, or I think this can be shortened to the degree speed contributes to score variation. And as mentioned before, again, I'm going to be talking about the evolution of both this concept and the methods to assess speededness. And I hope this presentation really helps set up the other presentations in this session. And I also want to mention that I am certainly not the first person to conduct a literature review on this topic. There are many high quality ones, including the 3 listed below. So in the early 1900s, the initial theory regarding timing was that speed and ability were actually interchangeable concepts. And this was heavily promoted by Spearman, particularly in his book, in the chapter about speed in his book, The Abilities of Man. And Spearman did not equivocate on this theory, saying that the almost unanimous view that some persons are unable to think quickly and yet are able to think clearly appears to be a most grave error. So that's not painting a good picture for people like me who really need to take their time and think before providing an answer. So in hindsight, this seems a bit extreme and is clearly not how we conceive of speed anymore. But let me provide some context for why this theory came to arise. And so in this era, rank order scoring was prevalent. So of course, time limits will alter your total test score if you set a time limit that doesn't allow examinees to reach the end of an exam. However, the idea was that the rank order score would still remain the same. The same people who would get high scores in the untimed version of a test would get high scores in a timed version of a test. And studies actually showed this to be the case, where correlations between timed and untimed administrations were high. And I found this actually a fascinating part of the literature, was how these studies were conducted. So in these cases, they would first administer an exam under a timed condition, then have the examinees switch the color of their pencil when the time limit was reached, finish the exam in that second color in an untimed setting, and then they'd correlate answers from the first color to the total score they would get on the exam. And of course, the implication of this theory is that time limits can be set capriciously and they wouldn't affect the validity of scores, as Morrison pointed out very frustratingly in his literature review in the 60s. So I mentioned, we don't know. We know that this is not the case. So what happened? And I think there was a strong pushback against this idea in the 40s, with Davidson and Carroll providing the most scathing critique, in my opinion, claiming the indiscriminate use of time limit scores is one of the most unfortunate characteristics of current psychological testing. And they provided both a theoretical and an empirical critique of these studies. From a theoretical perspective, they argued that this idea of correlating a time score with a total score inflates the correlation because the time score represents a part of the total score. And this is particularly problematic when the time score, the time limit, is set such that examinees can finish a large number of the items before having to switch to the untimed section, as shown on the far right there. If that's true for a lot of the examinees, then of course your correlation is going to be incredibly high. They also had an empirical component through a factor analysis, where they found distinct factors for untimed scores and completion time. And then they also found that timed scores loaded or correlated with both these factors, suggesting that time scores were influenced by both completion time, or speed, and untimed scores, or ability. And so there are many other studies that rapidly advanced our understanding of how speededness affects scores in the 40s and 50s. This is covered in depth in Brent Bridgman's chapter, and I hope he will be speaking to some of this in his presentation as well. But now I'm going to move to quantifying speededness. So this mounting evidence that time limits did affect the validity of scores spurred the field to move towards methods to quantify test speededness, with Gullickson really leading this advancement in his Theory of Mental Test Scores chapter, where he formalized the concepts of speed and power tests. So a speed test has a strict time limit, contains very easy items such that if you see the item, you will get it correct. So your score then becomes the number of items you were able to answer before this strict time limit. In a power test, there is no time limit. Items vary in difficulty such that your score is simply the number of items you can answer correctly. So to be clear here, the errors in these exams, the errors that examinees would be making, in speed tests, it's the number of unattempted items. In power tests, it's the number of incorrect responses. So using this idea, this concept, Gullickson defined a metric of the proportion of speededness as, across the sample, the standard deviation of unattempted items over the standard deviation of all errors, so unattempted and incorrect items. And I should note that this is unattempted items specifically at the end of the exam in sequential order. Stafford simplified this to the sum of unattempted items over all errors. And Cronbach around this time also described experimental designs you could use with speed and power conditions. I think Brent will also be talking a little more about that, hopefully. But surprisingly, none of these methods became widely applied according to Donlan. And my interpretation based on the reading was that the field really needed something more practical, and these methods were hard to interpret, the values you would get from these methods. And I think the field received that in the form of Swineford guidelines, which were published in an ETS test manual in '56 and reiterated a few times. And these guidelines said for a test to be unspeeded, all examinees must reach at least 75% of the items, and at least 80% of examinees must reach all the items. And this gave practitioners a clear dichotomous metric of whether a test was speeded or unspeeded. And so these guidelines, I think, gained high prominence, really, and you still see allusions to them in test manuals today, sometimes direct references to the guidelines in test manuals today and the standards themselves, which state that At the bare minimum, practitioners should investigate the proportion completing the exam and the proportion of examinees omitting items, which you can see corresponds to the 2 guidelines mentioned by Swineford. So understanding that at this time, in this era, practitioners were working under very restricted data. Understanding that, Rindler did critique 2 key assumptions made by these methods. First, that all marked items represent a fully informed response. And the second assumption that all and only unmarked items at the end of an examination reflect the influence of time limits. In essence, this boils down to it requires examinees to never rush and guess as time expires, something that is not going to maximize their score, to just leave items blank. And Rindler states, questionable in theory and certainly violated in practice. I don't want to be too harsh because there's not much else they could have done without the data that we currently have available in computer-based testing, which really spurred a revolution in how we view timing, and particularly how we assess test speededness. And specifically, we're now able to directly assess these critiques by Rindler with response time data and process data. And the use of item response time to inform test speededness was really led by Schnipke in the mid-90s, who used graphical and database displays such as item response times by item position to see if there was a sharp decline in item response time suggestive of rapid guessing towards the end of an examination. Also, response time distributions, sometimes by correct and incorrect responses, to see if certain items elicited what's called rapid guessing behaviors or short, uninformed responses that also were reflected of guessing perhaps due to short time limits or running out of time. I think, so Schnipke did find that examinees guessed, essentially violating some of the assumptions made by these methods previously, but perhaps the most important thing to come out of this work was this classification idea that responses could be classified as solution behaviors or fully informed responses, and rapid guesses or short, quick, uninformed responses that don't reflect the ability being measured. Now, this is going to be, I think, heavily covered by Steve, so I don't want to get too much into it, but it does underlie a lot of the methods we currently use to assess test speededness, particularly in low-stakes examinations. And another area I'm not going to be able to cover in depth is all the work that has come out with the increase in computing power that allows us to now use response times directly in modeling. So there's been plenty of work done in simulating and experimental design on how timing affects parameter estimates and test properties. There's also mixture models now that can classify responses into the behaviors I mentioned earlier, the solution and rapid guessing behaviors. Van der Linden's model has a lot of beneficial properties. His response time model has a lot of beneficial properties for setting time limits and creating equivalently timed forms and other test development procedures. And we're using response times for detecting cheating and many other sophisticated models that I just don't have the time to cover, but are highly fascinating. So in terms of the history, I think I'm going to close by talking about the standards briefly. And I say briefly because the standards have actually remained relatively consistent across time. So the first edition of the standards, pictured here on the right, had 2 standards dedicated to timing. And that was C18, which, paraphrasing, boils down to providing evidence on the effective speed for timed tests, and D61, which talks about the reliabilities you can and cannot use for timed tests. In 2014, we have one standard, 4.14, dedicated directly to test speededness, which says that we need to examine the degree to which scores include a speed component. But I will say that this standard provides a lot more guidance than had been done previously in other standards on how this might be done. Still, I kind of would echo Liu and Cerisi 2007's argument that we need a little more coverage in the standard given the importance of test speededness in its effects of validity and the ubiquity of timed testing. So in conclusions, I think there are several key future directions that would benefit the field in terms of its investigations of test speededness. The first is accommodations, which are typically given in the form of additional time. However, I don't think the field has much guidance on how much time should be given or how to investigate whether that time was appropriate. I know Mike talks about this a bit in his chapter, and Ben Lovett's chapter is directly about testing timing and accommodations. Also, I think the familiarity differences with technologically advanced items and just different types of assessment as we move towards more tech assessments is going to present a major issue with regards to timing. And I know Deborah Harris and Wayne Camara talk about this in their chapter. And then my last point being, I think we still as a field haven't fully considered how to work with timing when speed is construct relevant. And as we move towards more authentic assessments, I believe this will play more of a role. So we've evolved rapidly from considering time as ignorable to defining time in terms of unattempted items to now having very sophisticated modeling approaches with timing data. That being said, I think we're going to continue to see rapid development given the ubiquity of time standardized testing and the importance of timing as it relates to the validity of scores. And I think you will see some of where we might be going in the next set of presentations. So with that, I will turn it back to Rich.
Okay, thanks, Dan. That was great. And just a reminder, everyone, that we'll have some time at the end for Q&A, so just hold your questions for now, and we'll come back to that at the end. Next up, we have Michael Kane talking about the impact of test time limits on validity.
Okay. How do I move this down?
I'm not sure. Ethan, are you on the call to give any assistance?
Okay, here we go.
Got it.
I think. So I'm going to talk about the impact of time limits on validity. And to begin with, I want to suggest that validity has to do with the interpretation and uses of scores. It's the interpretation and uses that are validated. And basically, I tend to suggest that we state the interpretation and use in terms of an interpretation use argument that lays out the assumptions and inferences that get you from the score to the conclusions that you want to draw. So it's the interpretation and uses of scores that are validated, not the test and not the scores. So the interpretation and use of different kinds of tests are going to have different implications for time limits. Can everybody hear me, by the way? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you, Mike.
Yes, we can hear you.
So we have this traditional distinction between power test. Power test, the assumption is that high scores reflect ability to perform more demanding tasks, whereas speeded tests, higher scores reflect speed in performing certain, usually routine tests. So pure speed tests tend to be more clerical speed and accuracy or something like that. Most of the tests that we have in education and other parts of the social sciences tend to be interpreted more as power tests. But even that is a bit questionable because these power tests, there's always a speed component. You know, if somebody is a physician or a lawyer and they can solve a problem that would take them a day, that would be done by somebody else in an hour, that certainly has implications for their effectiveness in practice. And lawyers, for instance, charge by the hour. So you don't want to go to that first lawyer who's going to be very expensive. For speeded tests, time limits are relevant to the construct. And for power tests, time limits are a source of construct irrelevant variance. But one of the complexities that we're going to have to deal with as we continue research in this area is that there's also some element of time in the constructs that we're usually measuring. Again, if somebody takes 4 hours to solve a simple algebraic equation, then you tend to think that they're not using algebra. So from the point of view of validity, we're going to be interested in time limits as a source of error. And we can think of the scores students would get without time limits. That is, if they had essentially a whole day to do a test that would usually be administered in an hour, as a platonic true score. The difference between these platonic true scores and the scores with a time limit are their time limit errors. So that if they had more time, they would get a higher score, and therefore the lower score contains an error. These time limit errors are systematic errors. They tend to be negative, so they don't have a mean of 0. And they can be correlated across forms. If somebody is consistently slow, then the error produced by the time limits is going to be consistent across scores, across test administrations. So I want to talk about 3 kinds of time limit errors. One is general time limit error for the population. It's the average time limit for the population. And it is a general systematic error for the time limit and the test. And the test administration, obviously. Second, we have an average TLE for a group, which I specify as TLE sub G, very creative, as a group-specific systematic error. And that's the kind of error that I think is particularly troublesome for these time limit questions. And then individual time limit errors for particular students, they are going to be hard to estimate, and I'm not going to spend too much time on it. So population time limit errors. For norm-referenced tests, any average effect of time limits for the population is irrelevant. So we don't have to worry about population level time limit errors. We can, if we calibrate the test correctly. For a criterion reference test, like a licensure exam, the time limit errors that are averages for the population is going to be a general systematic error. And it may have the effect of essentially increasing the cutoff score because it makes it more difficult to achieve the passing score. So group-specific TLEs, say based on race, gender, or disability, raise issues of fairness. If speed is irrelevant to the construct of interest, any group-specific TLE is going to be a systematic error and a source of bias. So if one group is slower than another group, but speed has nothing to do with what's being measured, then the slow group suffers a kind of bias because of the time limits. Individual time limits can be consistent across replications, and if they were, there would be specific systematic errors, and we contribute to true score variance in estimating reliability. So if the time limit is part of the construct, this wouldn't be a problem, that these time limit, what I'm calling a time limit error, would contribute to the true score. But if it's not part of the construct of interest, then the specific time limit errors for individuals would be a source of error, but they wouldn't show up as error in estimating reliability. To the extent that the time limit errors for individuals vary across replications of the assessment, they'd function as random errors. So they would look like just random fluctuations from one administration to another. Now, we want TLEs to be small. Like most sources of error, we want the TLEs to be small enough to not interfere with the interpretation use of the scores. The estimation of the TLEs will generally require targeted empirical studies, and group-specific errors can be particularly troublesome. How small do we want these errors to be? Well, independent errors add in quadrature. That is, we don't add errors at the level of scores, we add them at the level of variances. And basically, the total error variance is equal to the square root of the sum, if we're looking at how two sources of error influence things. The total error is the square root of the sum of the variances of the error. Now, this has a particularly interesting effect. If, for instance, you have a standard error of measurement of 3 and a TLE of 1, then when you square the 3, you get 9. When you square the 1, you get 10. If you take the square root of that, you get 3.16. That is, adding an error of 1 to another error of 3 increases the total error by about 5%, not by a third. So a rule of thumb that I would suggest is that the TLE should be smaller than SEMs, the standard errors of measurement, and preferably considerably smaller, like by a factor of 3. If they're smaller by a factor of 5, they can basically be ignored because they'll be very small. I think it's important that we try to be sensible about error, including time limit errors. We should be concerned about the overall assessment error and its overall effect in the context in which the scores are being used. We should be particularly concerned about systematic errors, which can be more serious than random errors because they don't average out. If you make the exam longer, they're still there. And if you repeat the exam and average the scores, the systematic errors are still there. So, for example, group-specific TLEs have serious implications for fairness and bias. But we need to be concerned about the total error, and therefore, if the TLEs are small enough, the impact on fairness and bias is going to be very small, probably smaller than other sources of potential bias or threats to fairness, and therefore, if it's small enough, it can be ignored. Although to some extent, a violation of fairness is never to be ignored, but as a practical matter, sometimes you can't address certain problems. ADA time limits particularly cause a pragmatic concern. Time limit extensions, as was mentioned by the last presenter, are common accommodations for test takers with disabilities. They're probably the most common accommodation that's given. Even if some other accommodation is given, they are often thrown in as an extra. But we don't have precise estimates of how long the extension should be or of exactly who should get one. And I think that being too liberal with the extensions that you give can have a potential impact on bias against people who don't get the time limit errors, the time limit extensions. If the time limits are tight enough that they do have some substantial impact, and some people don't have the time limits and some people do, that tends to introduce some sorts of bias. So to maintain a level playing field, it is desirable that the time limits be ample for most test takers. And I would even be willing to give up in certain circumstances. It all depends on the context in which you're doing this. But you might give up something in terms of reliability to have more extended time limits. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mike. That was great. And now we'll pass it along to the next presenter, Brent Bridgman, who will be talking about how to tell if a test is speeded and how not to tell. Brent, take it away.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted now. Is my screen showing?
Yeah, I can hear you and see your screen.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm just trying to see if we can determine, or how we determine if a test is speeded, and ways that we shouldn't use to tell if a test is speeded or not. So the traditional methods that Dan already mentioned briefly have some problems, that they can often be misleading and they don't actually work. And we often have to actually rely on results from experimental studies rather than from these within test sorts of indicators. So if we go back to the 40s and 50s, much of the speediness research was theoretical and not experimental, and was often based on very questionable assumptions. So Harold Gullickson, certainly a very good psychometrician, wanted to find a way of determining the reliability of a power test when he had information from a speeded test. And so he says, if it's possible to obtain some reasonable approximation for the number of items k in the speeded part of the test, we may use equation so-and-so, and he gives the equation. But what is the speeded part of the test? As we'll see later, speededness effects are not limited to items at the end. So if you remember nothing else from what I say, that's the message. You can't tell speededness only by looking at the end of the test. Fred Lord had the same problem. Again, certainly a brilliant psychometrician, but he has this assumption: if it is assumed that items are squared 0, 1, and there is no correction for guessing, that the examiner reads the items in order in which they are administered, and that he does not attempt items he has not read, then you can use this method. In other words, we have a nice method here that works only if examinees behave in a way in which rational examinees would never behave. So Swineford, again, 56 is often given as the date of her statistical report, but actually she was looking at it previously to that back in a 1949 report that she did for the law school admissions test. And in that she says, she gives some data and says it is generally assumed that the testing is satisfactory when it allows about 80% of the candidates to reach the last item. Under this assumption, it is clear that the two sections are much too highly speeded. The LSAT did not have a correction for guessing at this time. So this data all depended on people acting in an irrational manner. That is, today, examinees would be told, guess your way to the end if you're running out of time. You have nothing to lose with no correction for guessing. In the 40s, apparently people hadn't yet caught on to that. So this method probably did work initially, but as people became more aware of how to game tests appropriately, these methods stopped working. Again, we've already talked about what the Swineford guidelines were. And there's actually two problems with the Swineford guidelines. They can go in either direction of either making an unspeeded test look speeded or a speeded test look unspeeded. So a speeded test would look unspeeded if examinees skip early items and answer the last item. According to Swineford, 80%, even 100% of the people could answer the last item, and you would conclude the test was unspeeded. But if students are free to skip items, then whether or not you answer the last item is really irrelevant. And an unspeeded test could look speeded if examinees concerned with correction for guessing intentionally omit the last item. So clearly, even if 100% of the examinees answer 100% of the items, the test could still be speeded. You can't depend on Swineford to tell you if a test is speeded or not, especially now in a world where examinees are encouraged not to take items in order. In fact, if we look at the advice on collegeboard.org, it says don't dwell on questions that stump you. Circle ones you decide to skip. You can return to them later quickly. Remember, a question you answer easily and quickly is worth as much as a question you struggle with or take a lot of time on. And the guidelines also say, remember, there's no penalty for guessing, so you should answer all questions before time is up. So if you follow the College Board guidelines, the Swineford guidelines become worthless. But it's not only the Swineford guidelines, though. It's any guideline that requires identification of a point at which meaningful responding stops and guessing begins. So I just give one example here, but there's lots of them. Detection of test speediness using the change point analysis. So it looks like a sophisticated thing to do. It's published in Psychometrica, but it requires the identification of a change point. That is, there has to be a point in the test at which you stop trying to meaningfully respond and you start to guess. But what happens if there is no change point? If the change point doesn't exist, this method, these studies, again, there's lots of studies that use some version of a change point analysis. So let's see if there is evidence for a change point. So we did a study a few years back with the SAT. And the study was designed to determine the extent to which more time per item raises SAT scores. There was a great concern at the time that a lot of students were getting disability accommodations that they weren't really entitled to. This was especially apparent when you noticed that like more than half of the people from Greenwich, Connecticut were getting accommodations for increased time because they could pay for expensive psychologists. And practically nobody from South Central Los Angeles was getting extra time because they had more trouble getting a diagnosis. So the question was, well, but how much time for these people that may not really need it, does it make a difference? If we just look at people that don't have disabilities and taking a standard test, how much does extra time benefit them? And so we created sections with fewer items than normal, which came out to the equivalent of 1.5 times standard time per item. And we could then compare the scores on these shortened sections to scores on common items from a standard length section. We had to do this approach because the time for the experimental section that didn't count was fixed. We couldn't change the time. Furthermore, we didn't want to change the time because that would signal to students that this was something different and not just a regular part of the test. So we did it on these unidentified experimental sections. We were worried that students would notice that even though the experimental section didn't always have exactly the same number of items, we were worried that they would notice that some of them were getting a very short test. And so what we did is we staffed up the call center and we got ready for this deluge of calls that was going to come in from angry test takers. My test didn't have the right number of items. What are you guys doing, you crazy fools? We did not get one single call from an examinee questioning the short section. So they apparently were just quite willing to accept it. So what's the evidence now for a change point? So we have these three tests. Again, the timing is the same for all three, but one test had 35 items. That was the regular standard timing. One had 27 items, another had 23 items. The 23 item test would be the equivalent of time and a half for each item. So if we look at the very last item there, 23, the last common item. So I'm only looking at items that were common across all three tests. It was the entire test for the people in the 23 item group, and it was 23 out of the 35 for people that had the standard length test. But I'm always looking at exactly the same 23 items. So if we look at the end of the test, we see, well, yeah, there is a difference there in the proportion correct on that last item. The people that had the longer test have a lower proportion correct. So, sort of the expected finding. But let's look back. In fact, let's look way back. Way back to common item number 2. There's already a substantial difference between people with the short tests and the long tests. That is, there is no change point because at the second item in the test, there's already a difference. Apparently from people that skipped over this item initially, ran out of time at the end, and so they couldn't get back to it when their time ran out. And again, because this is part of an operational test, these are all huge groups. There's 8,000 people in each group. So if you can see any daylight at all between these dots, it's statistically significant. And I would argue it's also practically significant. The difference between 70% correct and 76 or 7% correct, in fact, makes a difference. And we can see the same thing in the math test. I'm sorry, the math test. So again, there's some small effect toward the end of the test that you might expect. But there's actually quite a large effect way back at common item 12, a difference between 60% correct and 70% correct, which I argue is not only highly statistically significant, but is also quite practically significant. So if you're looking for a change point, where does meaningful responding switch to guessing? There is none. People go back, they change answers, they run out of time, so they can't change some item that they had skipped earlier. So you really can't find a change point. We also then looked, though, is this extra time more beneficial to lower ability examinees than to higher ability examinees? And quite surprisingly, what we found was for people that often complain the loudest in the lowest ability groups, the extra time made absolutely no difference. In fact, it could even be negative. So study 1 and study 2, because we replicated it, we wanted to make sure that the results we had in the first test, in fact, would hold in a second test, and they did. Essentially no effect at all for low ability people. In math, it was a little bit different. You did get some of an effect for people in the middle ability levels, but again, for people in the lower ability levels, extra time made absolutely no difference at all. So we also looked at whether there was any relationship or being especially beneficial for women, minorities, non-native speakers, and no, none of these came out significant. And it's hard to come out not significant when you have 8,000 people per group, but the differences were not even statistically significant. We can't, though, say anything about benefits for students with disabilities. You'll have to read chapter 4 to look at disability effects, because we, again, we did not have disabled students in this sample. There's other approaches to timing. There's experimental approaches that I won't really go into, where you change the timing rather than just change the number of items per unit. The problem with these is that the students will know that they're in a special condition because they're getting a time limit different than other people are. And once you know you're in an experimental study, you can get strange results. We don't know if identified experimental section had a big effect on these results, but we do know that motivational levels can certainly be important. So if you're doing any kind of a timing study where there might be motivation differences, or you're dealing with an unmotivated sample, you have to be very wary of the results. So just a few conclusions. In any speededness study, you need to pay close attention to the assumptions needed for meaningful. If you assume there's a change point and there isn't, your analysis will all be wrong. Don't assume that studies have identified experimental data will lead to accurate conclusions. If students are unmotivated or understand that they're in a study of speededness, the data may not be useful. But do assume that some attention to speededness is needed for any new or revised time test. Thanks. Back to you, Rich.
Thanks, Brent. That was wonderful. Next up, we have Paul DeBoek, who will be talking about response times in cognitive tests, interpretation, and importance.
Thank you, Rich, but I think the previous presenter needs to stop sharing the screen for me to share the screen.
How's that? Better?
Thank you, that's great.
Using my co-host powers to help you out there.
All right. I hope you can see my slides. Good afternoon. This presentation is based on one of the book chapters, and Frank Raymond is a co-author on that chapter. Most of my presentation will be focused on understanding response time phenomena in order to answer the question above, that is, how much time should we give to complete a test or to respond to individual items. So that is my approach. Now, meanwhile, you need practical solutions. And so the last slides will focus on practical solutions before fully understanding. So of course, it depends how much you need to understand, but my standards for understanding are pretty high. I can afford because I have an academic position, so I can keep going. Here is the content. I will first tell you about the correlations between response time and accuracy across persons and items. Then I will take a closer look at local dependencies. That is, you may be familiar with the van der Linden model. Well, that's a fine model, but it comes with local dependencies that are not explained. And I will focus on those local dependencies because I think there are interesting things to see. And then I will spend some time on possible explanations and finally answer the question what to do. So here is a very brief summary of correlations between accuracy and speed. And if you want to know more, you can read the chapter. The correlation across people is really depends on the test. It can be positive, can be negative, can be zero. That's not true for items. For items, it's usually the case that there is a negative correlation. That is because difficult items need more time. That's like a trivial finding. Now, these correlations, they may help to strengthen the measurement because there is information in the speed for the ability if they're correlated. But so that's all fine, but I want to take a closer look, and I did through a research program, and you see here the output of that program, and in red is the chapter in the book, and just above you see a broader overview of models for response time and processes in cognitive tests. So there are local dependencies. So if you apply the van der Linden model, or equivalently, if you control for the person and item parameters, there is still a correlation between response time and accuracy. On average, faster is more accurate. And that is true for a multiple choice and open format, high stakes, low stakes, with and without time pressure. which is an intriguing phenomenon. Now, that cannot be explained by variation of the speed accuracy, and it cannot be explained by fast guessing or speededness, I think, that negative correlation. So we're gonna take an even closer look, and with pictures and not model-based. It's not that I don't like modeling, I do it like on an everyday basis, but I also like the raw data as such, because each model comes with its assumptions. And so I wanted to look at the phenomenon without any assumptions, so raw data. And look beyond linear dependencies. Most of the dependency models come with a linear dependency. So here, because there are no limitations that come from the model, we can see the real shape of the dependencies. And the method I'm going to use is double centering. That is, remove the log response time differences between persons and items, then group the log response times into bins and look for each bin at the proportion correct, and then plot the log response time against proportion correct. And larger dots represent bins with higher frequencies. Here is the result. It's the same slide I presented at the conference. Look at the right side. The right side is after, the right column is after double centering. And by the way, these results are published in the paper that I mentioned here. Now, where are we looking at? We're looking at 5 tests with responses from 5,300 applicants. And the tests on the top are more knowledge-based, and further down, they're more based on reasoning. Then on the x-axis, you have the residual log response time. So remember, individual differences are eliminated, item differences are eliminated. That's what the double centering does. On the y-axis, you see the proportion correct per bin on the x-axis. And amazingly, these shapes are all very similar, and they're quite different tests. And the curves first go up and then they go down. So this is the shape of the dependency. It's not linear, it's curvilinear. The vertical solid line is the top, indicates where the maximum is, and the 0 is, I don't know whether you can see the 0, which is the mean response time, where the residual is 0. And now you can see why, on average, the dependency is negative, because the tail of the curve is larger and bigger. But if you look at the whole curve, it's not just negative, it is curvilinear. Now, this may explain this curvilinearity. There has been a paper by van der Linden and Glass to argue that the dependency is minor. Well, that's perhaps because the curve is curvilinear. When we check the dependency, it's always there. So, and amazingly, surprisingly, it was a happy surprise. The year after we published our paper, Maria Bolsinova and Dylan Molinar found this. Using modeling and a non-parametric approach for the dependency. And so this is like an independent finding. It's just one item, but most items show the same shape of the curve. So I was reassured that we had something. It was replicated in 5 different tests, and here it's replicated in still another test with a quite different method. So it's intriguing to see this and to trying to understand what that dependency means. Now I will go to possible explanations. And one explanation I would summarize as a different view on abilities and tests. And a second is meant to be an all-encompassing explanation. That is, of course, way too ambitious, but why not be ambitious? Let's look into the explanations. Here is the first one. And this is what one of my students did. He saw the curves. He said, I can reproduce them. And he also does drift diffusion models. And these are conditional accuracy functions. And so they're very similar to what I did. They control for, I mean, there are no individual differences, there are no item differences, and that's why it's called a conditional accuracy function. And he played with two types of variance. The first variance is eta. If eta is 0, and the second variance is S, if that is 0, that's the black line. So there is no dependency. Now, what do these variances mean? The eta variance is the variance of the activation of the ability during the test. So that means that the ability of the test taker is the activation of the ability is actually varying during the test. And for some people, it would vary more than for other people. And this is the eta. The second is what I call an ability scattered across items. Think of vocabulary. Vocabulary, you can be good at it or not so good at it, but say, as a non-native speaker, my English vocabulary is not so good. But then there are other people with about the same poor level of vocabulary, but they know other words than I know. That's what I mean by scattered vocabulary. I mean, there is no uniform increase or decrease. It depends on the words. So my set of words is going to be different from the sets of other words. So the ability is scattered across the items. It's not uniform. Well, the more that is the case, the larger the S variance. Now look at what's happening. If it is just the activation of the ability, then we find a negative curve, which means faster is better. If the S variance, so how much the ability is scattered across the items, that leads to a positive. And if you combine the two, those are the turquoise and the blue curves, the two variances are larger than 0. So now, and this is an idea I have, it's actually the first time I'm expressing it, the idea. This is like a signature of the test and the group of testees. It would tell you what's happening. Is the activation of the ability varying across the test? And how scattered is the ability? So what one could do actually is to do this double centering. And perhaps for some tests, it would be a flat line. For other tests, it would be an upgoing curve. And then it could also be a decreasing curve. And that is, I think, a pretty easy way to find the signature of the combination of your test with the participants, the people who did the test.
Pardon me, Paul. Sorry for the interruption. Just about a minute left.
Oh, 1 minute left. Okay, then I won't do the second explanation, and I will go to what to do until more is known and established methods are available. There is an extremely high correlation between slow and fast ability. So if you measure the ability on the basis of fast responses and slow responses, that correlation is very high. And second, and that's again empirical from work with it, there is a very high correlation between ability measured with and without time pressure. I think an interesting criterion to find out whether it matters is what would be the correlation between two tests for the same ability. And follow fairness principles, do accommodations. And I do know that my time is up. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Paul. That was great. Okay, now for our last speaker, the man we've all been waiting for, the man, the myth, the legend, Steve Wise, talking about a cessation of measurement, identifying test taker disengagement using response time. Steve?
Thanks, Rich. Whenever I'm in these fine presentations, I always feel like I'm in a Monty Python skit. I'm always in the now for something completely different position. Today, I'd like to talk about test taking disengagement and where it corresponds or is related to time. Now, so our chapter talks about this. I'm going to give you a brief overview in the time I have. Let's start by talking about what we do in achievement. And we all know this, but it's worth a brief review. You know, we develop a series of items, we administer it to a test taker. These items are carefully chosen to measure some intended construct or domain. Then we take the information from each of those item responses and aggregate them across items to yield a score. Now, there's a basic universal assumption underlying this process and the models we use to score. And the assumption is that each item response reflects what the test taker knows it can do. This requires something, though, from the test taker. It's not just a function of the items, but it requires some information about, or it requires something from the test taker. It requires them to be engaged. And response time is useful in understanding whether or not this is occurring. Specifically, I've been looking for a while at rapid guessing behavior. Rapid guesses being responses occurring much faster than you need to read an item, solve its challenge, submit an answer. And we interpret this as saying that the person isn't really trying to apply their knowledge of what they know and can do to answer the item. And this occurs in two different contexts. The first we've heard a lot about this morning is a timed high stakes test. As time is running out, people may resort to this behavior of rapidly entering responses in the remaining time. Otherwise, they'll get the answer wrong. Essentially a strategic choice. And the other is in untimed low stakes test, when the test taker is unmotivated. There's nothing in it for them, maybe in their view. There's very few personal consequences. And so they may just decide they don't want to participate. But in each case, the behavior has some similarities in that the test taker is disengaged. They are not using what they know and can do to answer the item. Conceptually, we can view this as two distributions, a bimodal distribution where there's a short distribution of response times corresponding to rapid guessing behavior, then a somewhat longer, more considered time distribution reflecting the people who try to dutifully enter the items. And what we do, and I think Dan George mentioned this, we come up with some sort of time threshold to differentiate, to classify. With this response, if it occurs too fast, we'll call a rapid guess. Otherwise, we'll call it a solution behavior. And I won't go into the idea of time thresholds. We have a lot of debate and different methods we've described, but the basic idea that there's a way of differentiating these distributions is applied in practice. Now, the primary assertion in our chapter that Megan Kufeld and I wrote is that rapid guesses reflect a distinctly different constructor-relevant response process. And the idea that it's a different response process is important for us to understand, what do we do with these things? And the evidence we provide for this assertion is three basic ideas. First, the accuracy of rapid guesses is discontinuous relative to that of solution behaviors. The accuracy rate suddenly jumps into some value typically lower than that which you see for solution behavior. Second, rapid guesses are often not psychometrically informative. Third, the rapid guessing accuracy reflects a psychological choice bias and not the construct being measured. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit more detail about the second and the third of these in the time I have today. The first
graph shows response accuracy for a multiple choice reading item that had received over 100,000 responses.
How about this? What my talk?
Test takers was divided into ability quintiles, and the accuracy of rapid guesses and solution behaviors was computed for each quintile. The black bars show the accuracy of solution behaviors. They exhibit the monotonically increasing accuracy we would expect. The more able you are, the more likely you are to answer the question. Said another way, the correctness of the test taker's answer to this item provides information about their ability level, which is what we're trying to estimate. This positive relationship is fundamental to achievement measurement. Now look at the gray bars, which show the accuracy of responses classified as rapid guesses. They are much more homogeneous across ability levels and without the monotonically increasing pattern. Because the likelihood of passing the item is roughly the same regardless of ability, the correctness or incorrectness of a given rapid guess provides virtually no information about ability.
Couldn't have said that better myself. That was from a narrated PowerPoint I did earlier this summer. I forgot the narration was in there. Now, this idea of non-informative versus informative responses, you can actually see it really interesting if you look at different time slices. In fact, you can see how quickly the behavior changes. In this graph, we can see that in the first 10 seconds, now this is a reading item for which the response time threshold was 9.5 seconds. You can see in the first 9.5 seconds, the responses are very clearly not very informative. Okay, there's not that monotonic relationship. And so this is essentially almost a randomish sort of response. It doesn't seem to have any relationship to ability. But just in the next 10-second time slice, it changes dramatically and stays changed for the remainder for most of the response time distribution. So clearly, what's going on here is different than what's going on a few seconds later. This is this idea that there's two different response processes going on. What we're trying to measure, and perhaps something is not what we're trying to measure. Now, the other part of evidence I referred to was option selection under rapid guessing. Under solution behavior, the correct options tend to be the most popular. And if you think about it, that's exactly what we want. If the correct answer is C for an item, C ought to be the most commonly chosen response. And that's normal for well operating items. But under rapid guessing, this doesn't tend to hold in a lot of cases. In rapid guessing, option popularity is driven by its position in the list of options. That is, in a 4-choice multiple choice item, B and C get chosen much more often than A and D. Option D gets chosen very little, regardless of whether it's the correct answer or not. It's just this notion that we tend to respond more to what's called a middle bias or edge aversion, a well-known choice bias. It's been studied. Yigal Atali at ETS first described this work in terms of educational measurement. Now, part of studying rapid guessing behavior is trying to understand what's going on. And Megan and I propose that it involves two different choices. The person chooses to do this, but it's two choices. First is, I encounter an item. Do I choose to engage in solution behavior or rapid guessing? And the second is, if I choose rapid guessing, what choice do I make? The first choice can be explained by dual processing theory, the sort of thing that comes out of Kahneman and Tversky's work. And the second is the demands capacity model. So we lay out some theoretical considerations of what underlies that first choice. Do I try or not try? The second choice is explained largely by the psychological biases I described a moment ago. So what does this all mean? Well, it comes down to what do we do with rapid guesses? And we've talked about a lot of models today where we think about shorter responses being somehow informative or being able to be used in understanding ability. We're arguing that they're just different. And they represent instances of the test taker saying, I don't feel like being measured at the moment. So the argument is measurement ain't occurring when somebody rapid guesses. Because if the accuracy of that response isn't related to our ability, why should we use that response in trying to estimate somebody's ability? And so the argument is that their measurement value is pretty limited. And therefore, except for certain circumstances, and we try to discuss those circumstances, we probably shouldn't use them in scoring because they're in amongst the other responses we have, but they're really not contributing to what our goal is of trying to understand the ability of the individual. And so one way of viewing them is these non-measurement responses that their presence tends to distort generally downwards test performance. And we often decide, is that something we want to do? If we're trying to, see if a person's, let's say, capable of graduating or getting a license to perform a job, then you might say, too bad if you didn't try on this test item, that's too bad. You haven't demonstrated what you know and can do. But in a low stakes setting, it very well may be the case that the presence of those responses are going to bias the answer you get. Maybe they're better excluded. And so there are some models that have been talked about that talk about excluding rapid guesses or non-effortful responses from scoring. Okay, I'm about out of time, so I'm going to stop there. And I know Rich wants to get on to some questions. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Steve. That was great. Okay, so if attendees have questions, you can put them in the chat and indicate if there is a particular person you want to target for your question, or if it's just in general, you can put it there. While we wait for that to populate, I, of course, would be doing my job if I didn't come prepared with some questions. So while we wait for people to enter in their comments or questions, I'll ask, maybe I'll start with Steve. So when you're showing those plots of how engagement might be different for those really rapid responses versus ones that may take longer, and this question might actually go to all the speakers as well, but do you think this could also speak to the idea that the construct that's intended to be measured might have some instability? So is it possible that maybe it could be part of motivation, but there could be some idea of fatigue that is contaminating the construct that you want to measure, that isn't allowing a person to sort of express their full aptitude? That maybe is that a choice of the motivation, but rather there's sort of like a decline that happens over time?
Hey, Rich, that's a very good question, and I used the word choice, and I tend to think more from a low stakes perspective, and that's probably my bias in this. And so I'm looking at somebody who sees an item in the middle of a test, and they just give a rapid guess, and we can talk about when we see things. Now, we do know that later in the test, response times go down, performance tends to, in our test, we've seen that performance seems to erode a little bit. There seems to be some fatigue in there as well. And so it's always an alternative explanation that, and when you can interpret that is fatigue is degrading your motivation. And what this suggests is that there's something in between rapid guessing and full effort, that there's something that's sort of a partial engagement. So in fact, some research I'm doing now, it looks at this notion of partially engagement or sort of degrading performance. We see this in things like position effects. If you think about the position effect research we see, I have difficulty seeing where that's anything other than this sort of eroding engagement. So I'll stop there.
Great, thanks. Does anyone else want to weigh in on their question, or I can ask another one? Okay. So here's another question. Oh, we have one in the chat. All right. This is a long one. It's that this person asks, if an item has a high rapid guess rate, doesn't that point to a construct problem for that item in that it provokes an unusual amount of opting out behavior? Steve, is there a systematic defensible way for test designers to determine the appropriate time limit for a test? Is there a need to incorporate expert, how long is too long judgments?
Let's talk about the first question. Yes, and in fact, I suggested that we ought to use things like the degree to which an item elicits rapid guessing is maybe some basic item analysis information you could provide, and we know in broad strokes the characteristics of items to show this. Items that seem to require more effort from the test taker, they're more likely to elicit rapid guesses. Like if there's a lot of reading, or some other factors we've studied, we can get a sense of which items tend to be more prone to this, and that's something you can consider when you're putting together a test. Now, the second question had to do with how long, and I wrestle with this. The idea of, because we look at rapid guesses, short times is saying that doesn't engage. Well, what if somebody spends like 5 minutes on an item? And I looked in our data at these people, and remember those information graphs I showed you on my presentation? Mm-hmm. They tend to be informative. In other words, if you look at somebody who spends like 5 minutes or longer on an item, higher ability people tend to have a higher likelihood of getting the item right. So there does seem to be information. I was surprised. I would think you might see that kind of flattening out of the information at the high end. I haven't seen it yet, which complicates this idea of what do you do with long responses? You can picture somebody staring out the window for 10 minutes with an item in front of them, not really trying, but the response seems to be related to ability. So I'm not sure what to deal with. That always leaves me unsure about how we should treat them.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, thanks, Steve. Here's a question that maybe I'll start. It's for everyone, but maybe I'll have Dan take a crack at it first. So Dan, you looked at what, like 100 years worth of research to inform your chapter, maybe actually going back further with that Chinese civil service exam. But we talk about a lot about how testing organizations have changed the way they're assessing time limits and technology and all those sorts of things. But what about from the test taker perspective, right? Have we learned anything from research about how the test takers have evolved themselves over time for how they approach assessments, or for how how they might be interacting with the construct that we want to measure?
Yeah, Rich, I think Brent covered this a bit in his talk as well. But essentially, in the early days of testing, if you will, the examinees followed procedures pretty strictly in that they would go through item by item, and rapid guessing allegedly was not occurring quite to the degree that it is now. And now, obviously, test prep and other, just test preparation in general is a multi-million-dollar industry, if not billion-dollar industry. And examinees are much more understanding of how to maximize strategies to maximize their scores. And I think that has certainly led to different test behaviors during administrations. Also, as Brent mentioned, the actual guidance from test companies has changed. Instead of saying you should go through one by one, now, as Brent showed, you have the College Board saying skipping items is perfectly a legitimate strategy. Don't spend too much time on items that you're not answering. And so I haven't seen literature that quite sums it all up, such as a meta-analysis or review of differences in test taker strategies. But I think you can piece it together from some of Steve's work and some of the work that's been done throughout time, where yes, the behavior has shifted much more to, let's say, score maximizing strategies. And I don't know, Brent, if you want to kind of jump in there.
Brent, I think.
Yeah, there's another interesting story related to computer adaptive tests that this is explained in the chapter, I think, and it gets fairly involved, but let me briefly try to outline the problem. That when the Jerry test first became a computer adaptive test, there was a problem that people that didn't finish the test wouldn't get a score. So if they ran out of time on the cat, they just wouldn't get a score, and they got angry. Well, I took this test and I did everything but the last item and you didn't give me a score. So then they tried to solve the problem by having a rule that as long as you did 80% of the test, we would give you a score, because in a cat, your fate estimate is fairly stable after you've done 80% of the test. But we then have a problem with clever test takers that say, aha, I actually only have to take 80% of the test, and so I can take my time and just work at a much slower pace. And of course, it was the most test-wise students that did this. And so you actually got an increasing gap by ethnic group and socioeconomic status, that it was those people that were especially able to take advantage of this 80% rule. And so then they instituted, well, this 80% rule isn't working. We got to get people to finish, so we'll put in a big penalty if you don't finish the test. But then that led to other problems, that people then, wanting to avoid the penalty, would guess their way to the end. And guess what happens when you guess your way to the end on a cat? So if I ran out of time 5 items before the end of the test and I guessed my way to the end, if I guess all those items wrong, my ability estimate just keeps dropping from one item to the next. So that we would actually see people whose scores could drop hundreds of points on the old 200-800 scale, just because they were guessing their way to the end. They guessed an item, so the computer gave them an easier item. Because they were guessing, they get that item wrong, and so it gives them an even easier item. So yeah, there's a lot of strategies involved. Again, it's kind of too complicated to get into here, but buy the book, folks.
Yeah, thank you, Brent. I know we're at time, so again, I just want to thank everyone for attending, and the presenters for their participation. And of course, I encourage you to check out the book on the publisher site, and hopefully coming soon to the NCME website. So thank you again, everybody, and I hope you have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Rich.
Thanks, Rich. Bye-bye.